Somewhere at the edge of charted space, a sensor operator named Reln Vokash was 3 minutes from the end of his shift when his console lit up an alert that would end his career, his sleep, and very nearly his sanity, all in the same night. 13,000 vessels, emerging from a region of space so empty that Council cartographers had simply labeled it the Dead Reach. No warp signature, no hail, no warning, just 13,000 hulls, unfolding out of the darkness like a nightmare the galaxy had told itself was over 43 years ago. Reln did what any sane operator would do. He assumed the sensors were malfunctioning. He ran a diagnostic. He ran it twice. And when the number 13,000 refused to change, he did the only thing left to do. He screamed for his supervisor, and the supervisor screamed for the sector commander, and within 11 minutes, the alert climbed every rung of the Galactic Council's chain of command until it landed, unbelievable and undeniable, on the desk of Counselor Prima Olive herself. She read the report twice before she allowed herself to laugh. It had to be a mistake, a glitch, a prank by some rogue engineering guild with too much time and too little supervision, because the alternative, the only other explanation, was a species that had been formally, ceremonially, unanimously declared extinct 43 years prior. Humanity. Olive remembered the vote. She had been young then, freshly seated on the council, and she remembered the solemn silence when the final human transmission from Earth had gone dark, followed by weeks of static, followed by nothing at all. She remembered the Keth Empire's envoys standing before the chamber with tears that looked almost real, mourning a species his own people had, as far as anyone in the room knew, simply failed to save in time. She remembered signing the extinction decree herself. One paragraph, one species erased from 100,000 years of galactic history in a single sentence. This is the first turning point of the entire war to come, though no one in that chamber recognized it yet. The moment the Council chose to believe a lie, because the lie was convenient. Now 13,000 ships hung in the dark, engines silent, weapons cold, waiting. Olive ordered every scanner in the sector redirected toward the fleet. What came back made her blood run to ice. The hull designs were ancient, older than any technology currently cataloged in Council archives, older than the Keth Empire's oldest colonies, older, some analysts whispered, than civilization itself. And yet the ships were pristine, maintained, upgraded, loved, in a particular way that only something built to last forever could be loved. For 6 hours, the fleet did nothing. It simply sat there, an accusation without words, while half the council debated whether to scramble a defense fleet, and the other half debated whether defense would even matter against something that size. Then, on the 7th hour, a single channel opened. Not a request, not a hail, a broadcast. Sent to every frequency the council monitored, every listening post, every relay station within 4 systems, so that no one could later claim they hadn't heard it. A woman's voice, calm in a way that unsettled everyone who heard it, filled the silence. This is Commander Yara Solis of the Sovereign Fleet of Earth. 43 years ago, you buried my species in a single paragraph and called it mercy. I have never seen the sky my ancestors were born under. I have never felt rain, or wind that didn't come from a recycled ventilation duct, or sunlight that wasn't filtered through 3 layers of radiation shielding. I was born in the dark, in exile, because staying in the light would have gotten every human being who ever lived murdered. A pause, long enough that half the listening officers thought the transmission had ended. We are not dead. We were never dead. We simply waited. And now, we have come to collect what was stolen from us. The second turning point arrived in the silence that followed, a silence Counselor Olive would later describe as the loudest sound she'd ever heard, because in it, she understood with absolute clarity that the galaxy's comfortable version of history was about to collapse. Word spread faster than any official channel could contain it. Within hours, every major network in Council space was replaying the transmission, slicing it into fragments, arguing over whether it was authentic, whether it was a hoax, and this was a question that made governments across a dozen systems quietly, urgently convene emergency sessions, whether the extinction of humanity had been alive from the very beginning. The Keth Empire, whose envoys had shed those almost real tears for decades ago, issued a brief statement calling the fleet's appearance deeply concerning and urging measured caution. It was the kind of statement written by people who already knew exactly what was coming and were desperately trying to control how fast it arrived. Aleph didn't wait for permission. She requested, no, she demanded, a formal audience, not a skirmish, not a negotiation through subordinates, a direct meeting between the Council and whoever commanded those 13,000 ships. The response came back in less than a minute, as though Yara Solis had been waiting for exactly this invitation her entire life. "I'll come alone," the message read. "Bring your whole council. Bring the Keth Empire's ambassador, especially. He'll want to hear what I have to say." That was the third turning point. The moment the Council realized this was never going to be a war fought with weapons first. It was going to be a war fought with the truth, and humanity had spent 40 years collecting ammunition of a very different kind. Somewhere in the heart of that ancient fleet, in a command chamber built by hands that had turned to dust 14,000 years before her birth, Commander Yara Solis closed the channel, looked out at the stars her ancestors had fled through, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine what it might feel like to finally go home. To understand what humanity had become, the Council would first have to understand what had survived. And the story began not with Yara Solis, but with her grandmother, a woman named Ellen Solis, who had made the hardest decision in human history on a night when Earth's skies were already burning. Ellen had been a low-ranking systems engineer, nothing more, when the Keth Empire's relief fleet arrived in Earth orbit under the banner of aid and alliance. The official story, the one fed to every human on the planet, was that the Keth had come to help humanity join the wider galactic community. The truth, uncovered only weeks later by a small team of intelligence analysts who never should have found it, was colder and simpler. Earth sat atop a resource vein the Keth Empire had covered for over a century, and humanity, stubborn and independent, refusing every partnership offered the Empire extended, had become an obstacle rather than a potential ally. The first turning point of humanity's exile came in a windowless briefing room, when a young intelligence officer named Marcus Reyes slid a data chip across a table and told the assembled leadership of Earth exactly what the Keth truly intended. Not aid, but erasure, dressed up in diplomatic language so no other Council species would ever ask questions. There was no time to fight. The Keth fleet alone outnumbered every human warship by a factor of 40. What Earth's leadership had instead was something the Keth had never accounted for, a desperate, brilliant, quietly assembled evacuation plan drawn up by engineers who understood that the only way to survive annihilation was to make annihilation appear to succeed. Over 11 frantic months, disguised as a mundane colonization initiative, humanity moved billions of people off-world in stage waves, funneling them toward a region of space so remote, so devoid of resources, that no empire in the galaxy had ever bothered charting it. Then, on the night the Keth fleet finally moved to strike, humanity detonated a series of catastrophic, entirely staged accidents across Earth's remaining orbital stations and colonies. Enough devastation, enough convincing wreckage and silence to make the Keth Empire believe their work was already done for them. Ellen Solis had been aboard the last evacuation ship to leave, watching through a viewport as the planet that raised or disappeared behind a curtain of manufactured fire. She never saw it again. Her granddaughter never saw it at all. The second turning point came 7 years into the exile, when a scouting vessel, sent out of pure desperation to find literally anything, any resource, any hope, stumbled upon a graveyard that wasn't a graveyard. 13,000 warships, dormant, hidden inside a nebula so radioactive that no sane pilot would have flown through it without a very good reason. They belonged to no known civilization. Council archaeologists, centuries later, would place their construction at over 14,000 years old, older than any spacefaring society currently alive, built by a people who had vanished so completely that not even their name survived. Humanity, exhausted, hunted, and out of options, did the only thing it had ever really known how to do. It adapted. Engineers spent decades reverse engineering alien technology that made humanity's own achievements look like stone tools. Children were born and raised entirely within the belly of that ancient fleet, taught history from data archives, taught astronomy through simulations because there was no sky safe enough to actually look at. Yara Solis was one of those children. She grew up running through corridors built by a species that no longer existed, learning to pilot ships older than agriculture, memorizing every recorded crime the Keth Empire had ever committed against her species, because her mother had told her, from the time she was old enough to understand, that memory was the one weapon the Keth couldn't take from them. They erased us from the record. Her mother used to say, so we became the record. Every year, every crime, every name. We wrote it all down, and one day, we're going to make them read it out loud. By the time Yara was 20, she commanded her own vessel. By 30, she commanded a third of the fleet. And when the Elder Council of the Sovereign Fleet, the aging survivors of the original evacuation, Ellen Solis among them until her death 8 years prior, finally voted that humanity was strong enough, patient enough, and prepared enough to return, it was Yara they chose to lead the fleet home. The third turning point arrived in the final Elder Council session before departure, when a dissenting voice, an old engineer named Corvin Hale, who had lost his entire family in the staged evacuation, stood and argued that humanity should not return at all, that peace and hiding was safer than justice in the open, that the galaxy, which had let their extinction be believed, would never truly welcome them back. The vote was close, painfully close, but Yara stood and spoke the words her mother had given her years before she died, and the council voted to go home. Now, as her shuttle prepared to carry her alone into the heart of council space, Yara Solis thought her grandmother's last transmission from a dying world, her mother's promise written in 40 years of evidence, and old Corvin Hale's warning that the galaxy might never forgive what it had done. She intended to find out. The council chamber had never held a session like this one. Every seat was filled, not just council members, but observers, journalists, and, seated with visible discomfort near the back, the Keth Empire's senior ambassador, a diplomat named Torvin Skell, who built a 40-year career on humanity, staying exactly as extinct as everyone believed. Yara Solis walked in unarmed, unarmored, and utterly unbothered by the weight of every eye in the room. The first turning point of the hearing came almost immediately when Counselor Olive, trying, in her own way, to be fair, asked Yara for proof. Not accusations, not a moving speech. Proof. Yara had expected exactly this, and she answered by activating a small archive drive her people had spent 40 years assembling. Intercepted Keth military communications from the night of Earth's destruction, internal Empire memos discussing resource extraction timelines for a planet everyone was supposed to believe was uninhabitable, and, most damning of all, logistics records showing Keth vessels quietly harvesting Earth's abandoned resource fields for over 3 decades after the supposed extinction. Resources that could only have been accessed because the Empire knew all along that no defensive force remained to stop them. The chamber, which moments earlier had buzzed with skeptical murmurs, went utterly silent. Ambassador Skell rose, his composure fraying at the edges, and denounced the evidence as fabricated, insisting the records could have been manufactured by anyone with enough motivation to embarrass the Empire. It was a reasonable objection, delivered by a man who no longer sounded like he believed it himself. The second turning point struck when Yara, without raising her voice, revealed the second layer of humanity's 40-year project. Not just documents, but witnesses. Dozens of humans, scattered across the galaxy for decades, living quietly among other species, had spent years working undercover inside Keth shipping operations, medical facilities, and even military logistics divisions, gathering first-hand testimony no fabricated document could replicate. One by one, recorded statements began to play across the chamber's main display. A former Keth logistics officer confirming resource extraction orders for the reclaimed territory. A medical technician describing casualty reports from a supposedly empty world. A shipping manifest clerk confirming decades of cargo runs to and from a planet the galaxy had mourned as a graveyard. Torvin Skell's objections grew thinner with every testimony, until finally he stopped objecting altogether and simply sat ashen, as 4 decades of carefully maintained lies dissolved in real time before an audience that included representatives from nearly every major species in council space. Then came the moment that would be replayed across every network in the galaxy for years to come. The third and most devastating turning point arrived when Yara activated a final recording. Not evidence of extraction, but evidence of intent. An intercepted strategic briefing, recorded by Keth military command in the days before the relief fleet ever reached Earth. in which a senior Keth commander outlined, in cold and clinical language, the calculated decision to eliminate humanity entirely rather than risk a species too independent to control and too resource-rich to ignore. The recording ended with a single line, delivered without hesitation by a voice the Empire could never again claim didn't exist. Total elimination is authorized. Ensure no survivors remain to contest resource claims. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a galaxy recalculating, in real time, everything it thought it knew about its own recent history. Counselor Aleph, visibly shaken, turned to Ambassador Skell and asked, in a voice that had lost all its earlier diplomatic caution, whether the Empire had anything further to say in its defense. Skell said nothing. He simply stood, gathered what remained of his composure, and walked out of the chamber, a silence that every observer in the room correctly understood as a confession no words could have made clearer. Yara Solis stood alone at the center of the chamber. 40 years of her people's patience finally laid bare before the galaxy that had buried them, and for the first time since her shuttle had left the fleet, she allowed herself to believe that justice, not just survival, might actually be within reach. Empires do not surrender gracefully, and the Keth Empire, cornered and humiliated before the entire galaxy, chose the only path left available to a power that had built its dominance on force rather than legitimacy: escalation. Within hours of Ambassador Skell's silent walk out of the council chamber, Keth military command, bypassing what remained of diplomatic protocol entirely, issued emergency orders to 3 border fleets stationed near the Dead Reach. Officially, the mobilization was described as a defensive precaution against an unidentified armed incursion. Unofficially, every analyst watching troop movements understood exactly what it was: an attempt to silence humanity before the rest of the galaxy could fully process what it had just witnessed. The first turning point of the crisis came less than a day later, when a Keth Strike squadron ambushed Yara's shuttle on its return journey to the Sovereign Fleet, a blatant, almost reckless act of aggression against an unarmed diplomatic vessel operating under formally recognized Council protection. It should have been a massacre. Instead, the ambush revealed something the Keth Empire had badly underestimated. Yara's shuttle, though small, was built on technology 14,000 years more advanced than anything in the Keth arsenal. Defensive shields absorbed the opening barrage without so much as a flicker, and rather than fleeing, rather than even firing back, the shuttle simply broadcast the entire attack, live, unedited, uncut, across every frequency the Council monitored, turning an assassination attempt into an unignorable public confession of continued hostility. The Keth government scrambled to claim the attack had been the work of rogue officers acting without authorization. Almost no one believed it. Certainly not Counselor Aleph, who convened an emergency session within the hour, visibly furious in a way career diplomats rarely allowed themselves to be in public. The second turning point arrived when the Sovereign Fleet responded, not with retaliation, but with a demonstration of restraint so overwhelming it terrified the entire chamber more than any attack could have. Rather than moving to strike the Keth border fleets in response to the ambush, Yara ordered a portion of the 13,000-strong fleet to simply reposition, silently, precisely, without firing a single shot, forming a perfect, impenetrable defensive perimeter around 3 vulnerable Council trade routes the Keth Empire had been quietly threatening to disrupt in retaliation for the hearing's outcome. It was a message far louder than violence. Humanity could end this in an instant, and had chosen not to, because it wanted something the Keth Empire had never once offered its victims: justice, not vengeance. Public opinion across Council space, already reeling from the hearing's revelations, shifted decisively. Species that had spent 4 decades treating the Keth Empire as an indispensable ally began openly questioning that relationship for the first time. Smaller member worlds, long intimidated into silence by Keth economic pressure, started coming forward with their own long-buried grievances, emboldened by humanity's example. Desperate to regain control and narrative collapsing by the hour, the Keth Empire made its final and most catastrophic miscalculation. The third turning point of the crisis came when Keth intelligence operatives attempted to sabotage the Sovereign Fleet's evidence archive itself, infiltrating a Council data facility where a secondary copy of humanity's 40-year record had been placed for a formal review, in a last, desperate bid to destroy the proof before it could be entered permanently into galactic legal record. The attempt failed, not because of superior human security, but because Yara, having anticipated exactly this kind of move from a species she'd studied her entire life, had already distributed dozens of redundant copies across independent, unaffiliated networks throughout Council space. The sabotage attempt was caught on record in real time, broadcast alongside everything else. A species that had spent a hearing insisting its own innocence, now caught in the act of trying to destroy the truth rather than face it. By the time the sun rose over the Council's capital station the next morning, the debate was no longer about whether the Keth Empire had committed atrocities against humanity. It was about how severely and how swiftly the galaxy intended to hold them accountable. Commander Yara Solis, watching the fallout unfold from the bridge of her flagship, finally allowed herself a small, tired smile. Her people hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't needed to. 40 years of patience had done what 13,000 warships alone never could have. It made an empire's guilt undeniable to the entire galaxy watching. The formal ruling session was, by unanimous agreement, moved to the largest chamber in Council space, a cavernous amphitheater built to hold representatives from every member world, because for the first time in living memory, every single one of them wanted to be present. Ambassador Skell had been recalled by his own government days earlier, replaced by a younger, more conciliatory diplomat named Dessa Iron, whose opening statement attempted, gently and carefully, to steer proceedings toward what she called a path of reconciliation rather than retribution. It was a reasonable-sounding phrase. It also happened to be the opening move of a much older, much colder strategy. The first turning point of the judgment session came when it was revealed, through documents obtained by a coalition of smaller member worlds emboldened by humanity's example, that the Keth Empire had spent the preceding week quietly offering trade concessions and debt forgiveness to undecided council delegates in exchange for lenient votes, an attempt to buy its way out of accountability that might have worked, had it not been uncovered and presented to the full chamber just hours before the final vote. What had been shaping into a debate about justice for humanity briefly threatened to become a scandal about the integrity of the council itself. Counselor Aleph, presiding over the session, faced immense pressure from every direction, from delegates who wanted swift, harsh judgment, from delegates quietly compromised by Keth bribery, and from a galaxy watching every moment of the proceedings live. She called a recess. When the chamber reconvened, she did something no one expected. She invited Yara Solis to speak not as a witness, but as a closing voice before the vote. The second turning point of the session arrived in that speech. Not a demand for vengeance, which many in the chamber had braced for, but requests that reframed the entire proceeding. Yara did not ask the council to destroy the Keth Empire. She asked for the return of Earth and every stolen human colony, full acknowledgement of the atrocities committed, reparations to fund the resettlement of a species still scattered across 100 hiding places throughout the galaxy, and formal legal accountability for the specific officials who had authorized the extermination order, not collective punishment of an entire people for crimes of their leadership. We did not survive 43 years in the dark to become the kind of empire that buried us, she told the chamber, her voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater and every screen watching across council space. We are asking you to prove that this council still means something. That is all, nothing more. The chamber, for a long moment, said nothing at all. The third and final turning point came during the vote itself, when Dessa Iron, the Keth Empire's own newly appointed ambassador, abstained rather than voting against the ruling, a quiet, unmistakable acknowledgement, understood by everyone watching, that even the Empire's own diplomatic corps no longer believed their government's position was defensible. It was a moment the outcome became inevitable. The final tally was read aloud by Counselor Aleph herself. Overwhelming, near unanimous support for humanity's restoration. Earth would be returned, its atmosphere fully restored at council expense. Every stolen human colony would revert to human governance. A special tribunal will be convened to prosecute the Keth officials responsible for the extermination order, separate from the broader empire, which would face significant but not crippling reparations, a judgment carefully calibrated to deliver justice without plunging the galaxy into an unnecessary war. When the ruling was finalized, the chamber did something council protocol had no precedent for. Delegate after delegate rose from their seats, not in ceremony, but in something closer to genuine respect. As Commander Yara Solis, born in the dark, raised in exile, carrying 40 years of her people's patience on her shoulders, stood at the center of the chamber and finally heard, out loud, in front of the entire galaxy, the words her mother had spent a lifetime waiting for someone else to say. The record is corrected. Humanity was never extinct, and the galaxy is sorry it ever let itself believe otherwise. Restoration, it turned out, took far less time than exile had. Council engineering fleets, some of the very same ships that had once patrolled the space around a planet everyone believed was a graveyard, now worked around the clock to reverse decades of atmospheric neglect. Ash gave way, slowly, to cloud. Cloud gave way, eventually, to rain. And 6 months after the ruling, for the first time in 43 years, sunlight reached the surface of Earth unfiltered by anything but its own atmosphere. The first turning point of humanity's homecoming arrived not with the great and ceremonial return of Commander Yara Solis, but with something smaller and in its own way, far more powerful. The return of the very first evacuation ship, carrying Ellen Solis's original engineering team, now elderly, some in wheelchairs, some needing to be carried, all of them weeping openly as their shuttle broke through Earth's restored atmosphere, and they saw, for the first time in over 4 decades, the blue and green world they had sacrificed everything to save. Corvin Hale, the old descending engineer who had argued against ever returning, stepped off that shuttle first, knelt down, and pressed both hands flat against the soil of a planet he had genuinely believed he would die without ever seeing again. Word spread through hidden human communities scattered across 100 worlds faster than any official broadcast could manage. For decades, humans had lived quietly among other species, disguised, cautious, never gathering in numbers large enough to draw attention, always ready to disappear again if the extermination order was ever renewed. Now, one by one, then in the thousands, then in the millions, they began to come forward. The second turning point of the epilogue came during what became known across the galaxy as the Great Surfacing, the coordinated, joyful, chaotic emergence of nearly 2 million hidden humans. People who spent their entire lives never once speaking their true names in public, never once admitting where they came from, stepping into the light of 100 different worlds within the same month to declare simply that they were human and they were finally safe. Council worlds that had unknowingly hosted human refugees for decades held spontaneous celebrations. Children who had been taught to hide their heritage stood in public squares and spoke their grandparents' names out loud for the first time. Commander Yara Solis chose to make her own return quietly, almost privately, several weeks after the first great wave of homecomings had already filled Earth's rebuilt cities with noise and light and impossibly imperfect new beginnings. She landed not in a grand capital, but in the quiet coastal region where her grandmother's original research facility had once stood, now rebuilt as a modest memorial. She stood on a beach she had only ever seen in old photographs, felt sand under her boots for the first time in her life, and watched waves break against a shore her family had bled for. The third and final turning point, quiet, personal, and far more meaningful than any galactic ruling, came when Yara opened a small data drive her mother had left her before she died, one final recorded message set to play only after humanity had truly, finally come home. Her mother's voice, younger and steadier than Yara remembered, filled the empty air of the beach. If you're hearing this, then it worked. Everything we sacrificed, everything we hid, everything we recorded and remembered and refused to let them erase, it worked. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see it. But I need you to understand something, Yara. This was never really about getting Earth back. It was about proving that we decide who we are. Not the Keth, not the Council. Us. Whatever you build now, build it because it's right, not because you're still afraid. You were born in the dark, my love, but you don't have to live there anymore. Yara Solis stood on that beach for a long time after the message ended, watching the sun set over an ocean her grandmother had once feared she'd never see restored. Part of the species of galaxy had once erased with a single paragraph. Humanity had not returned as conquerors. It had returned as something the galaxy hadn't accounted for in its calculations of power. A people patient enough to wait 43 years in the dark, disciplined enough to gather the truth instead of taking revenge, and united enough to walk back into the light together, refusing, after everything, to become the very thing that had once tried to erase them. Some civilizations, the galaxy was finally learning, are simply impossible to erase.